They're all okay. Okay, so as we are now going live. Welcome everyone to the European School of Theosophy, which was founded in 1981 by Geoffrey Farthing and other theosophists. Before beginning, let us just take a moment for inner reflection. From the unreal, lead me to the real. From the darkness, lead me to the light. From death, lead me to immortality. Thank you. My name is Juliet Bates, and I am part of the team of the school. The school offers lectures and online courses on a variety of topics, as well as organising seminars and conferences. This year, the EUST is commemorating its 40th anniversary in the mysterious and mystic land of Egypt, and you are all very welcome to join us at 2 conferences being held in Egypt, and we would like to thank the Blavatsky Trust for their support. From the 16th to the 21st of October, we will be in Luxor with our conference entitled The Veil of Isis, with optional tours also including Cairo. Whereas the International Theosophical History Conference will be held in Alexandria from the 13th to the 14th of October. Furthermore, look out for the London conferences being planned for June 2024 in London. You can register to receive our newsletter to keep updated on all of our programs and not miss anything. The EUST is a not-for-profit organisation, and the large majority of our programs are free of charge. So please support the work of the school by making a donation. The EUST has also been very active in publishing. What had started as a seed, a simple project of publishing selected writings by the early theosophists from Blavatsky's Lucifer magazine, took on a life of its own and grew into the first 23 volumes of the Lucifer collection, the Blavatsky years, 1887 to 1891, which were released last year. They are available on Amazon and will be followed by the post-Blavatsky years, which will conclude this fascinating collection numbering around 50 volumes. It was indeed a fascinating and inspirational journey to bring back to light the writings of those early authors, making them accessible for readers today. Dr. Franz Hartmann was one of those early theosophists, and another seed was being planted across the ocean by Dos McDavid. He wanted to have several of Hartmann's books in German, translated into English, and published to make them available to everyone. On approaching the EUST, he found very fertile ground and enthusiasm to the point that his initial idea to publish 5 books grew to 10 volumes, becoming the Hartmann collection. As with the Lucifer collection, it did not end there. The seeds Dos planted were nurtured and grew further to produce the Hartmann lectures, which will focus on individual volumes presented by some of the people who have dedicated their energy, passion, and time to bringing these volumes into the spotlight. There will also be a website dedicated to Franz Hartmann. The first series of lectures, held in June and July, continues today with the talk given by Suzanne Hopfel-Wellenhofer entitled Paracelsus, edited by the EUST and is volume 3 in the Franz Hartmann collection. Next Sunday, July 30th, Juliet Bates, who's me, will present An Adventure Among the Gnomes, which is volume 1 in the Franz Hartmann collection, and which closes the first series of Hartmann talks. Your microphones will be muted during the lecture and will not be able to be unmuted until question time at the end. To ask a question, you can either write it in the chat or use the raise hand icon. Thank you. It is now my honor to introduce today's speaker. Suzanne Hopfel-Wellenhofer was born in Austria and has been living and working in the US since 1986. Even before finding Theosophy and beginning to attend lectures in 2009, she has been following her own spiritual path, comparing religion, science, philosophy, and psychology for over 20 years, and created her own website about her research, which is https://spiritualityconsciousnessandme.com. She is currently the president of the DC Lodge and will be on the board of the TSA from July 2023. She contributes to the Theosophical Wiki on a regular basis, mentors prisoners, and creates courses for the online School of Theosophy. She has a law degree from the University of Graz and a master's degree in educational technology from George Washington University, where she worked for 20 years before retiring in 2019. She still translates German to English, including texts from the Theosophist, Dr. Franz Hartmann, and she also teaches yoga. So welcome once again to everyone, and let me pass the word to Suzanne and what I'm sure will be an exceptional talk on Paracelsus. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this lovely introduction. I'm so happy to be here, and grateful that Erika invited me to talk about Paracelsus, because this is not a book I translated. This has been available in English for many years. I hope you can see my PowerPoint. So I will introduce the book because that's what I was asked to do, but Paracelsus is dear to my heart, and I have been reading texts by him, and I have been doing research. So whenever I think there's something that is important to add, I'll share that with you, even though it is not in the book that, that Franz Hartmann wrote. So why should we, as Theosophists, know something about Paracelsus? Well, one of the reasons is that H.B. Blavatsky wrote a little bit about him. And she said that he was the most wondrous intellect of his age and original thinker. He was really one of the most enigmatic figures in history. And what was so great about him, he was open to new and nature-compliant healing approaches. And he was regarded as a reformer of medical practice. Those who have heard me speak before, when I do research, I always look for quality that really speaks to me. And last time I talked about Franz Hartmann and introduced the book Yoga and Christianity, I said I really admired his ability to as a synthesizer. And this comes really through in his book, Paracelsus, and also when he wrote about the Jakob Böhme, a German mystic. So what spoke to me about Paracelsus is that he was such a phenomenal observer. And he had this ability to deduce from his observations and trust his intuition. So I wanted to share a little bit more about Paracelsus and Theosophy. Blavatsky also said that he was a great mind who had created a new mode of thinking on the natural existence of things. And she mentions him in Isis Unveiled. In volume 1, for example, she said he was the first to discover and describe hydrogen, which was a new element then, and knew well all its properties and composition. She pointed out that he had studied astrology and astronomy, and that he, in his writings, asserted that man is in a direct affinity with the stars. She also said Rosicrucians as alchemists became proverbial, and they gave birth to the more modern Theosophist, at whose head was Paracelsus. This can be found in the collected writings. So the title, as Julia pointed out, this is volume 3, and the title is The Life and the Doctrines of Philippus Theophrastus Bombast of Hohenheim. He was known by the name of Paracelsus, and and underneath it says The Science of Finite and Infinite Life. And here we can see the title. So the book has 372 pages and has a preface, and then, as in all the books from this collection, it has a description of the front piece, a brief introduction of the life and works of Franz Hartmann, and the preface of the original edition. And then we have the chapters: the life of Paracelsus, the writings of Paracelsus, explanation of terms used by Paracelsus, cosmology, anthropology, normology, magic and sorcery, medicine, alchemy and astrology, philosophy and theosophy. And then we have an appendix 1 and an appendix 2, which is the autobiography of Franz Hartmann. So who was he? Well, we see here a portrait by the Hirschfeld collection, and he was a Swiss, on the left, he was a Swiss physician, a philosopher of nature, an alchemist, a lay theologian, and an occultist. He was an original and prolific author of 16th century Europe. And he wrote about medicine, surgery, natural philosophy, alchemy, astronomy, natural magic, and Reformation theology. A little bit about that. So let me share what we find in the preface. He said, Hartmann said, among those who have taught the moral aspect of the secret doctrine, there are none greater than Buddha, Plato, and Jesus of Nazareth. And then he continues with a few other names. And he said, they obtained their knowledge not merely from following the prescribed methods of learning, or by accepting the opinions of the recognized authorities of their times, but they studied nature by her own light and becoming illuminated by the light of divine nature. They became lights themselves, whose rays illuminate the world of mind. And that was the thing really that worked for Paracelsus, because he actually, it was a point where he said he hadn't read anything for several years. He really explored, investigated, observed, and then drew conclusions from that. And he says, he continues saying, what they taught has been to a certain extent verified and amplified by the teachings of Eastern adepts, but many things about which the latter have to this day kept a well-guarded silence were revealed by Paracelsus 300 years ago. So one of the things that's important to understand was the historical background. Hartmann says the dawn of the 16th century called into existence a new era of thought and was the beginning of the most stupendous and important accomplishments of those times, the Reformation of the Church. In bold is quotes from Hartmann, and the other part I added. So first of all, during that time, the Earth was recognized as a globe. And you know, anybody who reads a lot by Hartmann knows that he had problems with the institution of the church, the dogma. So he said that the time was ripe for shaking off the incubus of papal suppression. And he also said that free inquiry took the place of blind credulity. And that was very important. And he said, in the department of science, there could be seen a general struggle of the new against the old, of reason against sophistry. Now, several things that happened during that time were very embarrassing for the church, but people were still careful about what they said because there was still the fear and the dread of the Inquisition. But Europe changed. No doubt about it, because people demanded the right to think for themselves. And they wanted to reach out into new and untried fields. And at the same time, universities started to pop up. So the life of Paracelsus, unfortunately, it is not quite clear, or we don't know the exact date, but it is assumed that he was born on November 14th, 1493, in Maria Einsiedeln, and that is in Switzerland. His parents were William, who was an illegitimate offspring of the noble Bombasts of Hohenheim from Swabia, and Schwabe. He was a physician and a bondswoman. And I just want to add something. I think I pointed that out last time. For me, this difference between personality and individuality is so important. Before we are born, we need to understand that we have to choose the right environment for our soul to evolve further. And this was the case because his father, he was a physician, and he was a very open-minded, knowledgeable man. But he was the illegitimate offspring, and his father had a temper and actually got in trouble later on. And he must have been a very challenging personality, and Paracelsus inherited part of this personality. He was not very diplomatic, very direct, and sometimes, very critical. So anyhow, when the mother died, he was relatively young. She must have suffered from depression. And so later on, he wrote about the treatment of the mentally ill, because that experience stayed with him. So in 1502, they arrived with he and his father in Villach in Carinthia, which is now in Austria. I just remember when I researched it, it's so interesting. We say, okay, they left and moved to a different city. Well, there were no airplanes, and there were no trains, and it wasn't that easy. And I believe it took them a long time, maybe even 2 years, to arrive there. And there his father became a town physician and a teacher. And he got early training: alchemy, botany, herbs, and their relation to stars, metallurgy, and even medicine. And Hartmann says in his book that the teachings were very similar to those of the Eastern adepts. This is what Hartmann writes in his book. He says, in his early youth, Paracelsus obtained instructions in science from his father, who taught to him the rudiments of alchemy, surgery, and medicine. He always honored the memory of his father and always spoke in the kindest terms of him, who was not only his father, but also his friend and instructor. He afterwards continued his studies under the tuition of the monks of the convent of St. Andrew, under the guidance of learned bishops. And having attained his 16th year, he was sent to study at the University of Basel. And he was afterwards instructed by the celebrated Johann Trithemius of Spanheim, abbot of St. Jakob at Würzburg, one of the greatest adepts of magic, alchemy, and astrology. So this is something I wanted to add. It's not in the in Hartmann's book, but for me this part was very important. So he worked for a time in the mines of FÜGER. So Villach was like a city where they had mines, and there you can see how he was able to observe things, and he also talked to everyone. And so the miners shared old folklore and curious beliefs, and he listened to them. And he realized, based on what they said, that minerals like plants and animals are born, they grow, they decrease with age, and they die. And so he realized that all bodies seem to have their roots in atmosphere or space. And he also realized that they derive nutrition from an invisible field of substance. And so eventually later on in his life, he wrote actually a book on the miners' sickness, because the miners, a lot of them got sick and died early, and other diseases of miners. So let's go on. So then there were the further studies. He's German, French. He was at German, French, and Italian universities, and he got a doctorate in medicine at the University of Ferrara. Probably 1515 or 1517 in that, it's not quite clear. And it seems that during that time, which was not that unusual during that time, he changed his name to Paracelsus. And then came the great peregrination. So he traveled to Italy, to France, to Spain, Netherlands, England, Denmark, Sweden, Lithuania. He was captured by the Tartars. This is a story. And he also went to Egypt, and he learned a lot there. And I just want to point something out. I have the same experience right now. I'm researching Cagliostro. So you have occultists who write about somebody, and then you have historians, right? And there were a lot of people who hated Paracelsus and wrote such mean things after his death, and even during his lifetime. And so it's very difficult to find the proper information. And then if you are a scientist or a historian and only look for the numbers and what can be proven, the biographies read very differently than when they're written by a theosophist or by somebody who believes in metaphysics or occultists. Anyhow, the climax of his career was he was in 1527 appointed town physician and lecturer to the City and University of Basel. He had helped somebody who was a great citizen of Basel with some illness, and then he suggested for him to come, and he came and he gave lectures, but then he had to leave Basel abruptly, basically overnight. So let me share a little bit. First, what Hartmann wrote about his teachings, because that already gives us a picture. But he said his lectures were not, like those of his colleagues, mere repetitions of the opinions of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, the exposition of which formed the sole occupation of the professors of medicine of those times. His doctrines were essentially doctrines of his own, and he taught them independently of the opinions of others, gaining thereby the applause of his students and horrifying his orthodox colleagues by his contravention of their established custom of teaching, nothing but what could be well supported by old and accepted authorities, irrespective of whether or not it was compatible with reason and truth. So let me share a little bit first before I go to this slide. For example, I just want to share some examples that I remember from my research. First of all, he lectured in German, not in Latin. So his colleagues were very, very upset about that, but the students liked it. And then he also didn't like the pharmacists and told the students they went out and they looked for plants, and he explained, what was going on in nature and talked about, assume about astrology. But there's one example that just tells us a lot about him. So one day he invited his colleagues, right? And then he came in with this silver bowl, and then it was covered. And then he asked them what they thought it was. And then he opened it, and it was urine and excrements. And he said, look, you cannot rely on what was taught hundreds of years ago. We have to look at the urine of the excrements of deceased people so we can get more information. They were appalled. They were upset. They ran out of the lecture hall. But we, of course, now in the 21st century know how true his statement was, because that's exactly what doctors do. Anyhow, this is from the chapter from the life of Paracelsus. He said, everything that happens takes place through the will of the Supreme. Conscience is the state which we have received from God, in which we should see our own image. and according to the dictates of which we should act, without attempting to discover reasons in the guidance of our life in regard to morals and virtues. He says, that's, Hartman paraphrasing Paracelsus, we should do that which our conscience teaches for no other reason but because our conscience teaches it. And of course, Paracelsus and Hartman, both of them, they say they were, the hypocrisy is the enemy. We have to really watch out for that. This is another thing that I thought was very important from the life of Paracelsus. There were Paracelsus taught 3 principal points as foundation of our wisdom. He talked about prayer, but it's not the prayer where we go and we say, please help our soccer team win, whatever. No, it's a prayer where we express a strong desire and aspiration for that which is good. The second one was faith, but it's faith based on self-knowledge, on unwavering confidence. So that we have to develop this trust in the universe, that trust in the divine, that whatever happens has to happen, that it's necessary for the universe to evolve, and for our personal the people have to evolve too. So whatever happens to them, whatever happens to me in this life, to Susanne, has to happen to me so that my soul can evolve. Another thing, and I thought that was so interesting, was imagination. Now, he says if this power is properly kindled in our soul, we will have no difficulty to make it harmonize with our faith or with our deep thought. So, and the next chapter is the writings of Paracelsus. And here we have a book. It's a German one. It's a copy of the Schriften des Theophrastus von Hohenheim. But the fact is that not a lot was published during his lifetime, and not a lot was written by him personally. It was actually dictated to him by him to others. 2 works came out. The one was De Gradibus, and that's Latin, E Compositionibus Receptorum e Naturalium and Chirurgia Magna. But then the rest was after his death. And Husserl was a follower, somebody who admired Paracelsus, and he published 10 volumes of his work from 1589 till 1591, and his medical and natural philosophical works. And I thought I would just throw in another story. So during that time, there were a lot of people suffering from syphilis, and they had come up with a treatment that Paracelsus was so appalled and so upset about, because he felt it was completely wrong. First of all, the dosage was wrong, and then they used some part of a wood that was imported, and which was completely useless in his opinion. But the owner of the company who imported this wood made a lot of money, and they made sure that that book that he had written about how to properly treat syphilis was not published during his time. So he had a lot of fights on many fronts. One thing that I really like in his books is that there is an explanation of terms used by Paracelsus, and he created a chapter out of it. And I will give 2 examples. And the first one is magic, how he explained that. He said magic, wisdom, the science and art of consciously employing invisible spiritual powers to produce visible effects. Will, love, and imagination are magic powers that everyone possesses. And he who knows how to develop them and to use them consciously and effectually is a magician. He who uses them for good purposes practices white magic. He who uses them for selfish or evil purposes is a black magician. Paracelsus uses the term magic to signify the highest power of the human spirit to control all lower influences for the purpose of good. The act of employing invisible powers for evil purposes he calls necromancy, because the elementaries of the dead are often used as mediums to convey evil influences. Sorcery is not magic, but stands in the same relation to magic as darkness to light. Sorcery deals with the forces of the human and animal soul, but magic was the supreme power of the spirit. Another word that I wanted to share from that chapter is AZOTH. So he writes here, it's the creative principle in nature, the universal panacea or spiritual life-giving air. It represents the astral light in its aspect as the vehicle of the universal essence of life. In its lowest aspect, the electrifying power of the atmosphere, ozone, oxygen, etc. And on the right side, you see a picture depicted is Paracelsus. And if you can see in the hand, he's holding a sword. By the way, if you read his the biography, they say that supposedly he went with his sword everywhere, and he even went to bed with it. But anyhow, and if you, I don't know if you can see that, but it says here AZOTH on the top, because in the sword's hollow pommel, it is said that he had this miraculous powder capable of transmuting metals, healing diseases, transporting bodies from one place to another. That's what is shared. He was, at one time, he was a army physician and surgeon, and healed, tried to help the injured, and had very unusual methods with that. So the next chapter is cosmology. I don't have excerpts from every chapter, but just those things that speak to me, right? So he says, and that he talks a lot in the book about macrocosm and microcosm. Of course, that came from Paracelsus, and that's also, of course, always taught in theosophy. He says the power that was active in the formation of the world was God, the supreme cause and essence of all things, being not only the father of the sun, but of all created things that ever were, that are, or will be, the Iliasta, which comes from Yuli, and that can be, I would translate it as matter, but it also can be forest. But anyhow, and Astra, it's the worlds of the stars, the primordial and original cause of all existence. I bolded the sentence because it reminds me of the Poems of the Secret Doctrine by H.P.B., you know, the first part. But also another thing that we learn that's very important when we study the secret doctrine is there's nothing dead in nature. Everything is organic and living, and consequently the whole world appears to be a living organism. And then as all things come from the same source containing the primordial substance of all things, they are all intimately related to each other and connected with each other and are essentially and fundamentally a unity. Again, I cannot help but think of theosophy. And as we know, that's how H.P.B. saw it too. So, as I mentioned before, he covers microcosm, macrocosm in more than one chapter. So here I pulled out what I felt was important from cosmology and the chapter about medicine. So he says, the forces composing the microcosm of man are identical with the forces composing the macrocosm of the world. And he says, Paracelsus, in the organism of man, these forces may act in an abnormal manner, which leads to diseases, which leads to outbursts. But when it comes to the great organism of the cosmos, it acts in an abnormal manner with earthquakes and floods. So if there's an imbalance, there are problems. And he says each living being is connected with the macrocosms and microcosm by means of this intermediate element or soul belonging to the mysterium magnum, from whence it has been received and whose form and qualities are determined by the quality and quantity of the spiritual and material elements. So on the left side is the picture of the cover page of a book in German, Labyrinthus Medicorum. It's Latin, but it says Oder vom Irrgang der Ärzte, which is like from the mistakes of doctors. I love this part because this is also from the Chapter magazine, because he said that the medicine rests on 4 pillars. Philosophy, but he explains that means it's the knowledge of physical nature. Astronomy, meaning a knowledge of the powers of the mind. Alchemy is a knowledge of the divine powers in man, and personal virtue, holiness of the physician. Now, this is not something that is taught today. This is not something that is applied today. What he says, and this is, I don't know if that's from this book or from other texts that I read by Paracelsus, but for him, it was so important that you have a good character as a physician and that you have this connection with the divine, right? That you believe that there is a divine, that there is this omnipresent force, this divinity. And if you don't have that, you cannot be a good physician. This is from the chapter of anthropology. He talked about these invisible creatures of the elements, and Charles Leadbeater wrote later a book about that too, that I read. But I mean, Paracelsus, he visited hermits, he explored myth and legends from gypsies, from alchemists and herbalists. And he affirmed, and he said, there are creatures in nature. So it was never spelled out like that, but it seems he was clairvoyant. And he writes about these elementals and said that adapted from writings of the Egyptians and other nations. Anyhow, I don't know if he was clairvoyant or if he just believed in the legends or what he heard, but he had a deep knowledge about this. And this is where we have the elementals from the element fire are salamanders, from earth are gnomes, from water undines, and from air sylphs. And he describes that they consist only of one principle, of a subtle principle. This is also from anthropology. Now, we learn in theosophy that we have these 7 principles. And on the right, I write them down, the Sthula Sharira, the Linga Sharira, the Prana, the life force, Kama, Rupa, Manas, and then Buddhi and Atma. And so he doesn't use the same words, but he has, Paracelsus uses the same principles. So what he calls the physical body, he calls elementary body. And then the astral body is also by him called astral-sidereal body. And the life force, the prana, is archeus or spiritus vitae. And then the mumia or animal soul is the desire body. And then we have the rational or human soul, the mind, the manas, and the spiritual soul, the flesh of Christ, and then the man of the new Olympus. I find that very fascinating. So I always was very interested in alchemy and astrology. And so I wanted to share something from that chapter. So Paracelsus says, to understand correctly the meaning of the words alchemy and astrology, it is necessary to understand the intimate relationship and the identity of the microcosm and macrocosm and their mutual interaction. And the microcosm and macrocosm may not only be compared together, but they are really and actually essentially one in their power and one in the constitution of their elements. Now, let me give you, before I come to the next slide, give you a little bit background information. So he really had problems with, that they came out, especially in Basel when he taught at the university, to just, recite what has been taught hundreds of years ago and was still applied. And so supposedly he even burned books by Avicenna and by Galen. So everything went back to the Hippocratic medicine, because from there we have the so-called 4 humors. They were vital bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. And it was taught and practiced that if there was a deficiency, there was an imbalance, and that led to illness. So Galen went further, and he suggested that a moderate imbalance in the mixture of these fluids produces temperament: phlegmatic, choleric, sanguine, and melancholic. And the imbalance of humors causes the illness. Paracelsus rejected that completely, disagreed with it. And I will tell you something. I was just recently in Quebec, and we took this wonderful tour in this St. Augustine monastery. A young man gave this tour. And back then, in the old times, if you wanted to be a nurse, if you wanted to heal people, you really had to become a nun. So there were the nuns, and he explained, he showed us the rooms, how they did. And he said, a lot of people, they tried to help, but they died because they used those practices that were taught by Galen. Unfortunately, nobody listened to Paracelsus back then yet. But anyhow, here's an example. Let's assume you are an angry person. He says that it's not because you have too much bile, but because the Mars, the combative element in his body, the invisible power that guides the production of the bile, is in a state of exaltation. He also says, if you're amorous, it's not because the spermatic vessels are overloaded, but because the Venus, the amorous element in the body, are in a state of exaltation. And he says, if there's a conjunction of the combative and amorous elements in this body, then it leads to jealousy. And, I also am an astrologer and really have been doing a lot of interpretations lately. And my focus is a lot on the transits too. And the transits of planets can cause issues because the sympathetic relationship existing between the elements representing these planets in the microcosm and the elements represented by those of the macrocosm leads to serious consequences unless counteracted by the superior power of reason and will. So my personal opinion, this is now me, is when you know your exact birth time and you look at your chart, and I'm not talking about what we read every day in the newspapers or whatever, that's not helpful. And also, I don't feel like the generic interpretations are that helpful. I mean, I have lots of books that can, help with this. But if you know the position of the planets and the transits, then it can help you. It can help you to understand your dharma better. It can help you understand your karma better. Anyhow, this is what Paracelsus also taught. Now, this is not from his book, but I am originally from Austria. I'm half Croatian, but I grew up in Austria, and the last years Paracelsus actually spent in Salzburg, and that's where he died. And he was then buried, and then his bones were moved later, but he's now in the churchyard of Saint Sebastian. And there's a mystery about his death. As I said, he was unfortunately very hated, and there are different explanations of why he died. We don't really know, so I don't know how important it is. But I wanted to share another thing. That is the monument in Einsiedeln. Einsiedeln is where he was born, right? And it's like the Paracelsus Park in Einsiedeln. And this is on one side there's this inscription. It says, in memory of the doctor, naturalist, and philosopher Theophrastus Paracelsus, innovator of medicine, father of chemotherapy, promoter of biology and wound medicine, savior of the spiritually neglected, herald of the medical ethos, idiosyncratic thinker and humble Christian, friend of the poor, born at the end of 1493 next to the Teufelsbrücke am Etzel. He died after a Faustian life on September 24th, 1541 in Salzburg, remembering his home in Einsiedeln. Now, Teufelsbrücke is the Devil's Bridge, and I have noticed that some historians and some of his enemies found this important, that it was the Devil's Bridge, and have written about that. I think, anyhow, I just wanted to point that out. So before I finish, because I wanted to give enough time for questions, I wanted to share some points that were, for me personally, important. Paracelsus taught that man is responsible for his use of energy. He also taught that he has to respect life around him. And he has to dedicate his skills to the service of those in need. And this is something we know when I know from doing research, when there were poor people, he will treat them for free. But there were sometimes people, who had gone everywhere for help and nobody could help them. And then they would reach out to Paracelsus, and they were rich. And they would promise him a lot of money, and then they wouldn't pay him. And that really, really upset him. Anyhow, but when there were people in need, he would help them. He also said that man is the alchemist and can transmute his body and being. And this is where this imagination, I had to research a little bit more to understand what it came. And this is even the tests, when you think about that, we have sometimes this research in medicine, these groups, and then some take the medicine, the new medicine, some the placebo. And so this plays an important role with that too. But anyhow, he believed that we ourselves can transmute our body and our being. And it's that it's our task, that's what we should do. He also said, he was born at the 1493, right? Man has to understand that food is a medium for the transmission of life force. Thus, nutrition is important. Something that we really have to, that we should really teach more. Let's put it that way. So I just wanted to say, today, for example, and this is more, of course, in Europe, not here in the United States. There's, for example, a Paracelsus clinic. It's a biological medicine for healing and health. It was founded in 1958 near St. Gallen, Switzerland, and attracting patients from all over the world. There's a Paracelsus Recovery Center, which is a treatment center. There's a Paracelsus Medical Private University. This is an institution organized as a private foundation with locations in Salzburg and Nuremberg. And a few years ago, I listened to a lecture on YouTube, and it was from a doctor who said, the way we treat people, it just doesn't work properly, and we have to find different ways. And this is where we have to go back to the teachings of Paracelsus, because he pointed out so many things that are helpful and really help heal people. And he's also seen as the father of homeopathy, just for your information. And that is all, and should give us a few minutes to for questions.